Welcome back, DPRV TV viewers. It's Chris Nichols here, and we've got a fun, nostalgic look back for you today because it's the 10-year anniversary of Fujifilm's X mount. And I've actually got a Fujifilm X-Pro1. This was the first mirrorless camera they made to take advantage of this new lens mount. We've even got the original trio. We've got the 18mm, we've got the 35mm, and the 60mm macro today. Now, it's funny having this in my hands again because it's been 10 years since I reviewed this camera actually a decade ago for the Camera Store TV. And you know, really today we're kind of exploring the same haunts that we did when we did that review. And what does it feel like to pick up a 10-year-old mirrorless camera, get in your hands again and shoot it? Where have we come since then? I know I've certainly aged quite a bit. I was young and beautiful and skinny back then. I had the Lada Niva, which was great, but yeah, here we are with the X-Pro1. Let's see what we do today. Remember that one, Jordan. Save that for later. Now, Fujifilm had earlier played around with this hybrid viewfinder, optical and digital, in their X100 series, and they moved it over to the X-Pro1. And I remember in the foolishness of my youth, I really didn't like the optical viewfinder. I was hung up on EVFs. I love the benefits that they provided to mirrorless cameras, be able to preview everything right away. But now that I'm playing with it again, although it is a little bit slow to get it started when you turn on the camera, I'm actually enjoying it. I'm going to try to use that as much as possible today. When the X-Pro1 came out, it was great to see that vintage look, which has served them so well for the last decade, and that it was really intended for small primes, especially with, you know, an optical viewfinder having those fixed frame lines. And I think firmly aimed at sort of the street shooter, Leica files, you know, that kind of compact pocket camera with compact primes was the real appeal. But for me, I remember the big changes when they went really the X-T1. I love that more vintage SLR styling, but more importantly, I think that's where Fujifilm started to recognize, hey, our system's really opening up in a more flexible way with a lot of other people wanting to get on board. Wildlife shooters, sports shooters, and that's where we saw a lot of interesting zoom lenses come out, and the whole Fujifilm system really just grow from there. So I'm just taking a look at some of the files here on the back panel, which is not bad. I mean, I'm using it quite a bit. They look nice, but I really can't wait to get these old files back on the computer because I haven't looked at old X-Trans files in a long time. You gotta remember, this is the first camera to use a Fujifilm X-Trans sensor, and back in the day, megapixel counts weren't high. I mean, this is 16 megapixels. You usually had to incorporate some sort of anti-aliasing filter to slightly blur and soften the image to avoid things like moire showing up. But X-Trans did away with that. They, did a different pattern than a standard Bayer implementation, and they were able to avoid a lot of the problems with moire for photos. Video is another story, but it was also notoriously difficult to work with. I mean, you could use Fujifilm Silky Pics, Capture One did okay. Adobe was notoriously difficult and had real problems editing these files, and people still complain to that to this day, 10 years later. But you know, it's a cool way to look back on things. It was an interesting implementation to get past moire on a sensor and still get nice sharp detail. And gotta remember, at this time period, Fujifilm started to really develop an excellent reputation for great color out of their JPEGs and very detail-rich images. So I just shot this photo in color, but I'm gonna try it black and white. I just have a feeling. And you know, it's funny going back into the simulation modes here, we don't have a lot, right? I mean, I've got Provia, I've got Velvia, I've got Astia, I've got the ProNeg stuff, which I never really liked on here. And then I don't even have Acros, I just have monochrome and then monochrome with some filters, and that suits me fine. I mean, I really like the Provia and Velvia simulation modes, and I always preferred the monochrome to the Acros. I'm gonna take the shot right now. And yeah, it looks great. But it's funny that in 10 years, we've gained so many more Fujifilm simulation modes, and the stuff that I'm missing on here is actually the vintage stuff, like the nostalgic neg and the classic neg, which is funny because it's like you got to go to a modern camera 10 years later to get the vintage stuff. So, you know, I'm shooting a photo here where it's very two-dimensional, it's flat. I specifically want to get a particular composition, and I haven't used this camera in a long time, but I'm actually still really impressed by how accurate the optical overlay is with its frame lines. You know, it's compensating for parallax and distance, and it's matching pretty much exactly what I see in the optical viewfinder to what I got digitally. These cameras did not have very advanced autofocus control. It was kind of clunky. I mean, I could hit the autofocus button, move my focusing point around manually with the control pad. Clearly no touch screens or anything like that here, but honestly, I'm just finding that doing single autofocus, center point, focus, recompose old school style is the only reliable way to really get decent autofocusing. And actually in that regard, it's pretty snappy, but anytime I try to go to anything more advanced, nah, it just falls apart. Hey, it's Jordan Drake here, being filmed right now on the X-Pro1 with the internal mic because there's no microphone input on this, to give you an idea of the terrible video quality that the Fujifilm XF line all started out with. I mean, this thing just shoots 1080-24 as a max. There's no control over your shutter speed, your ISO. The video is just incredibly soft. It's covered in moire if you have any fine detail on it. And it's just crazy to think that 10 years ago, this is where they started, where now a bunch of my favorite mirrorless cameras for shooting video are Fujifilm. You know, strive to improve yourself, people. It is possible. All right, so our light levels are dropping here. We're gonna stick around, just do a bit of night shots, just like we kind of did 10 years ago. So surrounded by puddles here, I will see you guys when it gets dark. There's no way this is gonna be sharp. All right, so I had a lot of fun shooting the Fujifilm X-Pro1. It was great to get into my hands again and just use a camera. And actually, the thing that surprised me the most is although it is 10 years old, it still felt quite current in a lot of ways. I mean, we've talked about some of the downsides, but really, it was still a really enjoyable camera to shoot. The files look nice, and I think a big part of that too is at the time, this was like Fujifilm's Kaizen kick, where they were really trying to keep cameras up to date. This camera had like 21 firmware updates come out for it. I mean, they added features like peaking and stuff years after the camera was released, and it really did help to build a loyal fan base and get some market share going. Maybe Fujifilm doesn't do that Kaizen stuff so much anymore. We've talked about that, but you know, this camera when it came out of the box was kind of broken and they needed to fix a lot. Luckily, modern Fujifilm cameras generally tend to be working great right out of the box. You know, we've played with older cameras and lenses on the show before, and it's always fun taking these history lesson trips and seeing how far we've come, but this Fujifilm X-Pro1 really is an interesting piece of history. I mean, really interesting to see how this was a niche camera that was intended for a certain kind of photography, and yet Fujifilm's now come to dominate the APS-C market and the medium format market. I mean, they've come a long way. And yet I think what surprises me the most is how they're able to hold on to that vintage kind of feel and heritage that they were really building 10 years ago. You know, it's strange. Coming into this video, I've always had in the back of my head for like the last 10 years that I never liked the X-Pro1. I think it, for me, was overshadowed by, you know, later cameras, the XE series, the XT series. But for whatever reason, playing with it again tonight, I don't know why that was, because I actually had a ton of fun using this camera tonight. As always, we really appreciate you guys joining us. Do leave comments below. Let us know what you think. Check out dpreview.com. We have sample galleries for the X-Pro1, so you can download them and see how much easier it is to edit them now than what it was before. But also really just to see how, even though it was 10 years ago, these files still have very interesting character. Check those out for yourselves. Thank you guys so much. Like, subscribe, and we shall see you guys again soon for another episode of Deep Review TV.